The glass-eyed man. The road stretched endlessly before me, cloaked in darkness and fog so thick it seemed to muffle the hum of my car engine. The occasional break in the mist revealed barren fields, their frost-kissed surfaces shimmering under my headlights like the glint of a blade. It had been hours since I last passed another vehicle, and the isolation was beginning to weigh on me. It wasn't the first time I'd made this drive home from my parents' rural farmhouse, but something about tonight felt wrong. The air was still, too still, and even the moon had abandoned its post, leaving me to navigate the shadowed world alone. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel as I flicked the radio knob, hoping for some station to break through the static. Instead, the sound that crackled through the speakers sent a chill down my spine. A low murmur, faint and rhythmic, like distant voices chanting in unison. I froze, my hand hovering over the dial. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and I could almost make out words, though they were spoken in a language I didn't recognize. Panicking, I shut the radio off. That's when I saw him. A figure loomed in the fog ahead, standing motionless at the edge of the road. My heart jumped as I slammed the brakes, my car skidding slightly before coming to a halt. For a moment I considered driving on. Surely this wasn't my problem. But something about him held me captive. He was tall and wiry, draped in a long, tattered coat that flapped gently in the night breeze. He leaned heavily on a cane with a glass orb embedded at its top, the orb catching and refracting the weak glow of my headlights in an unnatural way. And then there was his face. It was pale, almost waxen, as if he were carved from ivory. His eyes were the worst of it, one dark and sunken, the other a milky glass that reflected the world around it like a distorted mirror. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence was magnetic. Against every instinct screaming at me to keep driving, I found myself rolling down the window. "Are you lost?" I called, my voice trembling more than I'd like to admit. He tilted his head, the movement bird-like and unnervingly precise. When he spoke, his voice was smooth yet dissonant, like the hum of a violin played just off-key. "Perhaps it is you who are lost." The word struck me like a blow, though I couldn't understand why. His glass eye glimmered in the darkness, holding me in its gaze. I was certain now that stopping had been a mistake, but before I could roll up the window and speed away, he raised a hand. "I offer guidance," he said, "for those willing to pay the price." His hand opened to reveal a wooden box, polished and ornate, with intricate carvings that seemed to shift in the dim light. My curiosity flared despite the dread clawing at my chest. "What kind of guidance?" I asked, though every fiber of my being screamed at me not to engage. He smiled then, a thin crescent of teeth that seemed almost too white, too perfect against the pallor of his skin. "For every secret you give, I return a gift. Something you need. Something you'll use. Something—" He paused, his glass eye catching the light again. "That belongs to you already." My stomach churned, but my eyes were drawn to the box. Without thinking, I opened my door and stepped out, the cold air biting at my skin. The fog seemed thicker now, curling around my legs as I approached him. He held the box open, and inside were trinkets, ordinary things, and yet each seemed to hum with a strange energy. A tarnished pocket watch, its hands frozen at 12:15. A rusted key with teeth that spiraled like jagged fangs. A withered rose, its petals blackened but intact. A shard of what looked like stained glass, catching the light in shades of red and blue. "What are these?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Memories," he replied. "Choices. Futures. Yours. Theirs. Perhaps someone else's. Choose one, and tell me your secret. A fair trade, wouldn't you agree?" I hesitated, but the pull of the objects was undeniable. My gaze settled on the pocket watch. It felt familiar, though I couldn't explain why. Slowly, I reached for it, my fingers brushing the cold metal. The instant I touched it, a sharp chill ran down my arm, and I gasped. The glass-eyed man chuckled, a sound that grated like nails on a chalkboard. "Now your secret," he demanded. I tried to resist, but the words spilled out of me as if pulled by an unseen force. "When I was younger, I ruined someone's life," I blurted. My voice sounded distant, not my own. "I lied to save myself. I accused a coworker of something I did. They lost everything because of me." The confession hung in the air, and I felt hollowed out, exposed. The glass-eyed man nodded as if satisfied and snapped the box shut. "You'll see the truth soon enough," he said, tipping his hat. Before I could ask what he meant, the fog seemed to close in, swallowing him whole. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rapid thud of my heartbeat. I stumbled back to my car, clutching the pocket watch. Its surface was cold and smooth, the hands now ticking furiously. It didn't seem to work properly. Its ticking was irregular, chaotic, and yet I couldn't let it go. Something about it felt necessary. As I drove away, I tried to convince myself it was all some strange dream, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. The watch sat on the passenger seat, ticking away, and with each erratic movement of its hands, I felt as though I'd wound a spring inside myself, tight and coiled, waiting to snap. By the time I reached my apartment, the city lights had long since died down, and the streets were deserted. The watch hadn't stopped ticking, its incessant rhythm burrowing into my skull. As I climbed the stairs to my unit, the sound seemed louder, as if it were no longer coming from the watch, but from inside me. Inside the apartment, I set the watch on the coffee table, its surface gleaming faintly under the harsh overhead light. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet, and for a moment I stood frozen, staring at the object as if expecting it to move on its own. Then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent, until I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was my voice, though distorted and distant, repeating the secret I had confessed to the glass-eyed man. The sound sent a jolt of fear through me. I snatched the watch and threw it into a drawer, slamming it shut. The whispering stopped, but the dread in my chest remained, heavier now, like a stone pressing against my ribs. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dim light of my apartment, the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the building my only companions. My eyes kept darting to the drawer where I'd locked the watch, as if it might crawl out on its own. Despite the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I dozed off on the couch. When I woke, it was still dark. My phone read 3:14 a.m., and the air in the apartment felt colder than it should have. That's when I heard it again. The ticking. It wasn't coming from the drawer this time. It was closer. My breath caught as I turned toward the sound. There, on the coffee table where I'd first placed it, sat the pocket watch. Its face glowed faintly, the hands spinning wildly, faster than any watch should be capable of. My first instinct was to run, but something kept me rooted in place. I reached out, hesitating as my fingers hovered over the cursed object. The moment my skin touched the cold metal, the ticking stopped, and then the whispers returned. At first, they were incomprehensible, a jumbled mess of words and phrases that tangled in my mind like threads in a broken loom. But as they grew louder, I realized they weren't random. They were my own words. My voice, confessing secrets I hadn't told anyone. Not just the one I had given the glass-eyed man, but others, darker ones. Things I had buried deep enough that even I had forgotten them. I never wanted him to come back. I lied about where I was that night. I should have stopped her, but I didn't. Each admission felt like a needle piercing my skin, sharp and unbearable. I dropped the watch, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, filling the room until I clapped my hands over my ears and screamed. The sound cut off abruptly, leaving me gasping in the oppressive silence. When I opened my eyes, The apartment was bathed in a strange, silvery light. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't coming from the overhead bulb, but from the pocket watch. Its glow pulsed steadily, almost like a heartbeat, and in its face, I saw something impossible. The glass surface no longer reflected the room around me. Instead, it displayed a scene, an image moving as if I were watching a film. The scene was a stark, dimly lit office I recognized immediately, my old workplace. Sitting at the desk was Sam, the man whose life I had ruined. He looked younger, less haggard than the last time I'd seen him. His face was calm, almost hopeful, as he pored over a stack of papers. Then the door opened and another figure stepped inside. Me. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. It wasn't just a memory. It was the memory. The day I planted evidence on Sam's desk, the day I ensured he would take the fall for my mistake. I watched as the scene unfolded with excruciating clarity. The careful placement of the files, the nervous glance over my shoulder, the satisfaction on my face as I left the room. The watch began to tick again, faster and faster, and the scene dissolved, replaced by another. This time, it was Sam's apartment. He sat slumped on a threadbare couch, a bottle of whiskey dangling from his hand. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair disheveled. He stared blankly at a stack of unopened bills on the coffee table. The despair on his face was suffocating, and I could almost feel it radiating through the watch. "Stop," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Please, stop." But the watch didn't stop. The scenes kept coming. Sam losing his job, his house, his family. Each one felt like a blade carving into my chest. And then it showed me something I hadn't known. The image shifted to a darkened room, the air heavy with silence. Sam sat on the edge of a bed, a revolver in his hand. His expression was vacant, his movements slow and deliberate. I screamed, slamming my fist against the watch as if I could break the vision, but it was no use. The final moments played out in agonizing detail. The sound of the gunshot echoed in my ears, followed by the dull thud of his body hitting the floor. When the glow faded and the ticking stopped, I was left staring at my own reflection in the watch's face. My eyes were wild, my skin pale and damp with sweat. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching the cursed object in trembling hands. The truth of what I had done pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. But as the initial shock began to fade, another feeling crept in: anger. The glass-eyed man had done this to me. He had forced me to relive my worst moments, to confront the consequences of my actions. He had taken my secret and twisted it into something that now consumed me. I had to find him. The fog was thicker than ever as I retraced my steps to the spot where I had first encountered him. The road seemed longer this time, the darkness deeper. My headlights barely penetrated the swirling mist, and every shadow seemed to writhe and shift at the edges of my vision. When I finally reached the place, it was as if the air itself had changed. It was heavier, colder, and carried a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I stepped out of the car, clutching the pocket watch like a weapon. "Show yourself!" I shouted, my voice echoing into the emptiness. At first, there was nothing. Then, slowly, the fog began to part, revealing the glass-eyed man. He stood in the exact spot where I had first seen him, his cane in one hand, the wooden box in the other. His smile was as thin and sharp as the blade of a knife. "You've returned," he said, his tone almost amused. "You knew what this would do to me," I spat, holding up the watch. "Take it back, I don't want it." He chuckled, the sound low and grating. "The truth is not something you can simply return, my friend. It clings to you, like the fog, like the shadows. Once it is revealed, it cannot be undone." "Then how do I get rid of it?" I demanded. The glass-eyed man's expression darkened, and for the first time I saw something in his face that wasn't amusement. It was hunger. "There is only one way to rid yourself of a cursed gift," he said, stepping closer. "You must pass it on. But be warned, The price will be steeper with each exchange. The truth demands balance." His words sank into me like a cold blade, and I felt the weight of what he was asking. To free myself, I would have to burden someone else, someone innocent, someone who hadn't made my mistakes. The glass-eyed man tilted his head, his glass eye gleaming. "What will you choose, I wonder? Redemption or survival?" The glass-eyed man stood before me, his presence suffocating in the fog that coiled tightly around us like ghostly chains. The pocket watch in my hand felt heavier, almost searing against my palm. I wanted to throw it at him, to demand he take it back, but the way he smiled, the way his glass eye gleamed as if it could see right through me, froze me in place. "You hesitate," he said softly, his voice a mixture of silk and gravel. "It's understandable. Few can bear the weight of truth once they've held it, and fewer still can pay its price." "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. His smile widened. "This watch, it's more than a trinket. It's a mirror, showing you not just what you've done, but what you've ignored. The lives touched by your choices, the ripples you've sent into the world. And of course it feeds on the one thing you can't escape, your guilt." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced as the scenes I had witnessed in the watch replayed in fragments. Sam's despair, his ruin, his end. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "How do I stop it?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "How do I make it go away?" The glass-eyed man tilted his head as if studying me. "You already know the answer," he said. "Pass it on. Trade your burden for another's. Share a secret. Offer the watch. And be free." His words lingered in the air like the fog, wrapping themselves around me. Pass it on. Trade your burden for another's. I felt sick. The thought of condemning someone else to this nightmare was unbearable. But what choice did I have? "What happens if I don't?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. For the first time, his smile faded. The glass orb at the top of his cane seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat. "Then the watch will consume you. The whispers will grow louder, the visions more vivid. It will show you everything you've ever tried to forget, everything you've hidden, even from yourself. And when it's done, it will claim you, leaving nothing behind but your secrets." The fog swirled around us, carrying his words into the darkness. I clenched the watch tighter, its surface unnaturally cold despite the warmth of my hand. I couldn't let it consume me, but I couldn't bring myself to doom someone else. "You always have a choice," the glass-eyed man said, his tone almost kind. "But remember, truth is never kind, and it always finds its way." Before I could respond, the fog thickened, swallowing him whole. I was alone again, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. The drive home was a blur. The watch sat on the passenger seat, ticking steadily now, each beat like a hammer against my skull. The road seemed endless, the darkness deeper than before. Every so often I glanced at the watch, half expecting it to glow or show me another horrifying scene. But it remained still, its face blank and cold. When I finally reached my apartment, the air inside felt heavier, like the building itself was holding its breath. I set the watch on the kitchen counter and stared at it, my mind racing. What if I destroyed it? Would that break the curse? The glass-eyed man hadn't said I couldn't. Without thinking, I grabbed a hammer from the drawer and raised it above the watch. The moment the hammer came down, the lights flickered. The sound of the blow was deafening. But when I looked, the watch was unscathed. Not a scratch marred its surface, and its ticking had grown louder, more erratic. Panic surged through me as the whispers returned, louder than ever. They weren't just in my head anymore. They filled the room, overlapping and echoing until I couldn't tell where one voice ended and another began. I should have stopped her. I lied. I let him die. The words twisted and tangled, creating a cacophony that drove me to my knees. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside me, clawing at my mind. When the whispers finally stopped, the silence was almost worse. I opened my eyes to find the apartment bathed in that same silvery light, the watch glowing faintly on the counter. My reflection stared back at me from its glass face, but it wasn't alone. Behind me, in the dim light of the room, was a shadow. It didn't move, didn't shift, but its presence was unmistakable. My heart pounded as I turned, expecting to see something standing there, but the room was empty. I turned back to the watch and froze. The shadow was still there, clearer now, and it was reaching for me. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in my panic. The shadow in the watch didn't move with me. It stayed there, staring, waiting. That was the moment I realized there was no escaping it. The glass-eyed man had given me a choice, but in reality there was only one way out. Pass it on. Part 4. The confrontation. I spent the next day in a haze, the weight of the watch pressing down on me even when I wasn't holding it. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The whispers were quieter now, but they never fully disappeared, always lurking just below the surface. I thought about what the glass-eyed man had said. Could I really pass this nightmare on to someone else? Could I live with myself if I did? By nightfall, desperation had taken hold. I found myself walking the streets of the city, the watch tucked into my coat pocket. The fog had followed me, curling around the streetlights and muffling the sound of my footsteps. I spotted a man sitting alone on a park bench, his head bowed as he stared at his phone. He looked tired, worn down, the kind of person who wouldn't question a stranger's odd behavior. My heart raced as I approached him, the weight of the watch like a stone in my pocket. "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling. He looked up, his eyes hollow. "Yeah?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. This was it, the moment of no return. If I gave him the watch, I would be free, but I would also be damning him to the same torment. My voice faltered. I couldn't do it. I couldn't hand him the watch, couldn't pass my burden on to someone else. But then, as I turned to leave, the watch began to tick louder, its rhythm quickening like a heartbeat. The whispers returned, faint but insistent, urging me forward. "Take this," I said suddenly, holding out the watch. It's a gift." The man frowned, confused, but something in his expression softened as he reached for it. "A gift?" "Yes," I said, my voice cracking. "Just keep it safe." The moment his fingers closed around the watch, the weight lifted from me. The whisper stopped, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. The man looked at the watch, his brow furrowing as he turned it over in his hands. "What is this?" "You'll see," I said, backing away. Before he could say another word, I disappeared into the fog, the sound of the watch's ticking fading behind me. When I got home, the apartment felt lighter, the air no longer oppressive. I collapsed onto the couch, relief washing over me. I was free, or so I thought. As I closed my eyes, a faint sound reached my ears, a ticking, soft but unmistakable. My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. The glass-eyed man had been right. The truth always finds its way, and it wasn't done with me yet. The ticking was faint at first, a ghost of a sound that I tried to convince myself wasn't real, but it grew louder with each passing second, steady and insistent, like the beat of a clock buried deep in my chest. I sat frozen on the couch, my heart pounding as the realization set in. I hadn't escaped. The air in the apartment grew colder, sharp as a winter frost. Shadows deepened in the corners of the room, stretching unnaturally, their edges jagged like shards of broken glass. My breath came in shallow gasps, visible in the freezing air. I stood slowly, every muscle in my body taut, and turned toward the kitchen. The counter where I had last seen the watch was empty, but the sound, the relentless ticking, was still there, louder now, echoing from the walls. "Stop it!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Leave me alone!" The room answered with silence. Then, just as I began to hope that I had imagined it, a whisper slithered through the stillness. "You chose this." I spun around, my eyes darting to every corner of the room. The voice was unmistakable, smooth and dissonant, like the creak of old wood underfoot. It was him. The fog seeped into the apartment, curling under the door and spilling through the cracks in the windows. It moved unnaturally, with purpose, coalescing in the center of the room. And then, as if pulled from the very fabric of the mist, he appeared. The glass-eyed man. His presence filled the room, his glass eye catching the dim light and refracting it in eerie, unnatural patterns. He stood taller than I remembered, his shadow stretching long and thin against the walls. "You passed the watch on," he said, his voice low and cold. "You thought you could be free." "I did what you said," I cried. "I gave it away. It's not mine anymore." His smile returned, thin and razor-sharp. "Ah, but truth cannot be so easily discarded. You passed the watch, yes, but the burden of your guilt remains. The watch may move on, but your secrets, they are yours to keep." My knees buckled and I sank to the floor. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. "To show you the cost of what you've done," he replied. He tapped his cane against the floor, and the room shifted. The walls dissolved, replaced by a suffocating darkness that pressed in from all sides. Then, one by one, images began to form in the void, like windows into memories I'd tried to forget. I saw Sam again, but this time, the scenes weren't from his life. They were from mine. I saw his eyes staring at me from the edges of every decision I'd made, his shadow cast across every choice. The lie I told had not only ruined him, it had shaped me, defined me, turned me into someone I barely recognized. The whispers returned, rising in volume, a chaotic symphony of voices that drowned out my thoughts. "You let him fall. You destroyed him. You could have saved him." I clutched my head, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The images grew sharper, the voices louder, until I couldn't tell where the memories ended and reality began. The glass-eyed man knelt before me, his face inches from mine. His glass eyes seemed to expand, filling my vision, reflecting not just my face but the faces of all the people I had hurt, all the lives I had touched with my selfishness. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking. "Please, just make it stop." His smile faded, and for a moment I thought I saw something close to pity in his expression. "There is only one way to end it," he said. "What? Tell me. I'll do anything." "You must accept it," he said. "All of it. The guilt, the pain, the truth. Let it consume you, and perhaps you will find peace. Or fight it, and let it destroy you." His words sank into me, heavy and final. I realized then that there was no escaping this. Not the watch, not the truth, not the choices I had made. I had spent my life running, hiding from the consequences of my actions. But now, there was nowhere left to hide. The shadows surged around me, swallowing the images, the whispers, the glass-eyed man himself. I was alone in the darkness, with only the ticking of the watch to keep me company. I closed my eyes and let it in. The guilt, the pain, the crushing weight of what I had done. It burned through me like fire, searing every nerve, every thought, until I felt myself unraveling. And then just as suddenly, it stopped. I opened my eyes to find myself back in my apartment. The watch was gone, the room silent. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if a storm had passed. But deep down, I knew the truth. The glass-eyed man hadn't freed me. He had simply given me a choice. Live with the truth or be consumed by it. I chose to live. But the fog still lingers outside my window, and every now and then, in the dead of night, I hear it. The faint sound of ticking, growing louder, closer. The truth never truly leaves. And Neither does he.